like the Peace of Westphalia and some of the accomplishments that Colbert, and kind of showing how FDR was challenged in much of the same ways. And they both had they were influenced. FDR was influenced by Colbert, and how, infrastructure moves economic development. And we can go on.
Sure. Yeah. Let's do it. That's.
Yeah. I guess what's so amazing about that period is that France was being a unique mediator during that period, after the 30-year war, or basically what helped end the 30-year war was the Peace of Westphalia, is my understanding.
Yeah, I mean, most people today, they hear the terminology Peace of Westphalia. If they hear it at all, it's either a relatively alien concept, or if they're studying poli-sci or history, or they'll have a concept of it from a very legalistic, boring standpoint. It really just refers to generally this treaty that happened in the 17th century, whereby nations started recognizing each other's boundary conditions for the first time, and sort of learned to just leave each other alone beyond certain agreed upon limits. So when you heard, sometimes somebody would hear like Tony Blair or Henry Kissinger giving a speech in the 90s saying we have to enter a post-Westphalian age, they didn't really have a lot of meat on the bones. It was a very foreign concept. Now, these guys knew exactly what they were talking about, and they didn't, when Kissinger or Tony Blair or others would speak this way. Mark Malloch Brown, who works closely with Soros, also has given speeches on the post-Westphalian age. When they're talking about it, they don't simply mean the end of an age of borders, but although they do mean that,
that's
they mean something deeper. And this has to do with this, I think, this devotion to Hobbesianism. So the oligarchy, they can only organize their societies around Hobbesian principles, which presume that human beings are just a beast to man, like that human beings can only try to subvert their neighbor to get ahead. That's like a really I shouldn't say bestialized view of man, because that's an insult to the beasts. I don't think the beasts even animals don't even act this way. But so the Hobbesian view is that human beings are just this terrible thing, that the world can only be a world of tension and ongoing constant war unless you have some stabilizing force from above the world imposing itself onto the world in the form of a Leviathan.
Yeah.
So this is how people of an imperialist worldview all tend to think. And the Peace of Westphalia was so much more than a treaty that was, it was a long fought for treaty. It took many, many years of organizing. And as you said, it was the grand strategists who made this happen over arduous secret diplomacy, back channels, a lot of work, was in France. And it was specifically Colbert, Jean Baptiste Colbert's mentor, a fellow named Cardinal Mazarin, who was sort of the éminence grise, the power behind the throne of Louis XIV in France. Right. And Louis XIV is somebody who was we've talked about this before. He's kind of an egotistical. He called himself the Sun King. He had a lot of flatterers. He had a God complex. He definitely did a lot of destruction in the course of his long reign. But he was the type of guy who, like many of these emperor types who are just born into this world of privilege,
right,
would allow himself to be influenced by good advisors, And so Jules Mazarin was able to often utilize, and he had a power of communication, a power of organizing other minds, and he really was able to tap into the best part of King Louis the XIV that allowed him at different times to be an instrument for the good. So this treaty, when it finally resulted in there was two actual treaties. One was signed by mostly the warring Protestants, the other one by warring Catholics in two different locations in the same year of 1648. It did do a lot to shift gears. It didn't fully end the age of the religious wars that came to be known as the 30 Years' War. It didn't fully, because the war, the world didn't have perpetual peace. There were problems, but it did go a long way. And one of the things that made it work on a legal level, yeah, you did respect boundary conditions, and that was the birth of the modern sovereign nation state in its modern fashion as we know it. But on a deeper level, when you actually read the treaty, which hardly anyone does, in even poli-sci who are developing master's degrees in political science, they don't read the actual documents, but you read the treaty, and it's a long treaty. There's something like 100 plus different components, but the first three serve as sort of the preamble, and especially that first part of the treaty, which says that we will begin to work for the benefit of our neighbor, the benefit of the other. And our personal sense of self-interest will be now recognized as contingent upon the well-being of our neighbor's self-interest. And that is the only durable self-interest, and it's non-Hobbesian, it's anti-Hobbesian. Hobbes would say that is impossible, that man can only be, right, a butcher to man, and we're all just trying to be the master over the slaves. No, this is a very different paradigm. And it also made the point, I think it's the second point, or maybe it's the third, that this will only work if we can forgive past transgressions. And it's been 30 years. People were born into war. Germany, which was the center of the battleground of a lot of this, but it's spilt over all over Europe. Germany had, there was like 2,000 prince electors, local warlords, each one, hiring their own, if they could afford it, their own mercenary armies, doing battle for little territories, generally Protestants versus Catholics, but sometimes Protestants versus Protestants and Catholics versus Catholics. It wasn't religiously defined that way. And it was just a bloodbath. Germany lost, like I said, it was like, I think it was a third of their population. The Black Forest was razed to the ground. There was no Black Forest. It was devastating. So the spirit of brotherly love, of real true Christian love, because you had Christians killing Christians. That's not a very Christian thing to do, but they were like, no, what makes Christianity work is that it's based upon love, right? And so they enshrine that in the documentation and premised an entire concept of international law around love. Now, again, what one says and what one does don't always align. Usually they don't. Look at the US Constitution, beautiful thing. Does it behave that way? Often falls short, but the principle is solid. And so when, again, just going back to Kissinger or Tony Blair, when they talk about the post-Westphalian age, they're really talking about an age of Hobbesianism controlled by a supranational leviathan that is above nations, which they want to bring back into play, which was what existed before 1648, and which oversaw, pretty much an age of oligarchism that was relatively unchallenged for a very long time. So.
It's interesting. It sounds like the good, the bad, and the ugly. And the only thing they just can't seem to get rid of is the good. Right? As much as they want us to even focus on the bad and the ugly, and we can try to dissect it and understand it, which I think is a good thing to do. But what they can't seem to get rid of is the good. Like these good ideas that got birthed during 1648, they got picked up, carried on with Colbert all the way across Europe and into the colonies eventually. It didn't take long. I mean, that's right around the corner in terms of time and history.
Right. Well, let's actually take that as a springboard to go through a little bit of the evolution of this after Mazarin and Colbert, because Colbert was still young. He was a prodigy of Mazarin. Mazarin did the heavy lifting, but then Colbert came in and became really his heir to that tradition and that fight. Right. Yeah. There are things that Mazarin couldn't do. He was not able to properly conduct war on the encrusted oligarchy and a lot of the corruption embedded within you can call it the French proto-deep state. Yes. He couldn't get a lot of that off the ground, although his accomplishments were quite good. Colbert was able to take the new environment of the post-Westphalian period of relative peace, and he did a number of things all at once. So beginning in the 1650s, 1660s especially is where it really kicks into gear. Colbert, who is now finance minister, he becomes the more than that. He's sort of like the minister of everything in many ways. He conducts a massive, I won't just say purge. He didn't just drain the swamp, but he really carried out what we'd only seen, in my mind, reflected again during the 1930s in the Pecora Commission in the United States under Ferdinand Pecora, where he was able to really carry out a full investigation into the abuses of the former finance minister who had carried out, he looted the treasuries for, countless sums, and just enriched himself and his network. He did a massive purge and brought in massive regulation as well into the banking system of France. And what's more important is that now that there was relative peace, the treasuries and the money in the treasury didn't have to get absorbed into the war, which was a very artificial way of making money. And people who say that, oh yeah, war is the way that nations get out of depressions and have economic prosperity. No, that's a lie. War is you're stimulating economic productivity. You're in this case, people are getting paid money to make swords and armor, but all of these things are going into being destroyed in the battlefield, and you're killing lives, especially lives of people who would be your customers in a healthy economy. So that's really
better ways to do it.
Yeah, exactly.
And that would look towards the future, right? Benefit of the other, benefit of the neighbor. Like that's looking forward. Like that. I mean, that's what's so different about the, globalist view versus the nationalist view of really wanting to improve the general welfare of all humanity, because that is what makes us great and be able to exercise our creativity in the most beneficial ways.
Yeah, absolutely. No, exactly. And this idea of the future is really like when thought about in a healthy way, that's really the solution to all of our problems, right? As an individual, we've all been through hard times. Sure. Most people have been through hard times, and it's only when you you break the cycles of the past that are holding you back, and you start focusing on the future. That is where creativity lives. That's where you can create a new self, new objectives, new capacities. It's like that for an individual, and it's like that for a society.
Yeah. Definitely.
And the expression for that in a society in general is economic progress. And Colbert and Mazarin, but Colbert especially, he unleashed some of the biggest. Now that the treasury was liberated from funding wars, they could put that towards now investing into canals.
Right. Yeah.
You had some of the biggest density of canal building that we'd ever seen in history up until that point, including things like the Vistula River development project, which was a whole bunch of different little mini dams, water management systems, bridges, roads, all the way through Silesia, Mazovia, East Prussia. This went into East Prussia. It didn't just stay in France. This was going to Germany. He was bringing in other nations to work on common interest projects that would both create real jobs, improve the conditions of life of the farmers, of the people living in the urban regions, would create manufacturing too, because people had to build the hardware that was going to go into building up these different canals and dams and plows and other things. So you're having a multifaceted transformation, both of the economy, but also of the culture, because now you have a society where, because you're thinking about the future, you're building things that are going to take 20, 30, 40 years to build. Your education system is changing. You need to have engineers all of a sudden, whereas formerly you just needed mercenaries. So your education system is now valuing the minds of young people
and the infrastructure is reinforcing the education, right? Because you're allowing ideas to translate back and forth, and so they're helping each other
as well. Yeah, exactly. So now you could transit to another country using roads that didn't exist, or canals. You could take boats inland and go from France to Spain or to Germany or Prussia or beyond. And that exactly that transmission of people and ideas now creates understanding as well, because now when you are interfacing with your neighbors, you're inclined to understand where they're coming from. Exactly. You're less inclined to think in a paranoid way about them, the way a lot of Americans are thinking paranoid about Russia or China, because they just don't know Eurasian culture. So that ignorance is a breeding ground for all sorts of reception of slander, of other things that paint Russia or China or India as like the evil bad guys that we have to be afraid of. So yeah, you have that happening. And yeah, I mean, there's like so many projects. You've got the Midi, the Canal du Midi is probably the biggest project that even Leonardo da Vinci had been looking at. How do you do this? A century and a half, even longer earlier before that. Charlemagne had already begun trying, but it couldn't figure it out, 2 centuries earlier. Or no, that was like 800 years earlier. Yeah. The Weser River. I mean, I wrote an article, and it's in my book as well, going through each one of these brilliant projects. Some of them were public.
Academy of Sciences and Technology, right?
Yeah. You had a Royal Academy of Science and Technology built up. That's what Leibniz came out of. So that was a breeding ground for genius, really just cultivating, like creating institutions that would just exist towards the cultivation of creative genius in science and the arts, which were not differentiated. And you had some of the greatest musicians, people who were designing new things like the piano, the modern piano or modern violin, were working with the Leibnizian circles who were making breakthroughs in science, because it was all about acoustics. It was about the geometry of sound, right? Which had a certain obviously a mathematical geometric component to it. And when you think about the golden section, how that organized the Stradivarius violins, Stradivarius was a part of these networks that came out of the Royal Academy of France and of Leibniz, and they were organizing these different salons. And he was studying the golden section as it is found in nature, the way Da Vinci was, right? And then creating what would be instruments that would reflect the best quality of sound produced by the golden section. And that's why his violins are to this very day unparalleled. They can't. I mean, I don't know, but I don't think that they've gone further than what he was able to do back in Leibniz's age. So, I mean, yeah, it was just so multifaceted, full spectrum. And sure enough, even though by the, turn of the 18th century, the world was looking bleak again, a lot of the positive developments were, of course, subverted. The oligarchy had not been extracted properly from Europe. France was pulled into more wars with either Spain, the Habsburgs, or with Britain. So the age of war began again. It wasn't maybe as abrasive as the 30 Years' War that was high density death, but it was still bad. There was no space to breathe and just build things again in that sort of vibrant way that we saw in the 1670s, 80s. So the importance in this sense of looking at the writings of Alexander Hamilton is really big, because Hamilton, you could see it in his Federalist Papers and his letters. He's citing and studying not just the ancient Greeks and Romans, and I'm talking about the Roman Republicans of people like Cicero's time, not the Roman Empire, to get a sense of like, how do we create this new type of nation far enough removed from the rot and corruption of the old Europe? But how do we also take the new and the best innovative insights into natural law that had exploded since the Renaissance in Europe itself, and how do we take that and incorporate all of the best of the ancients and the moderns into a new type of society that had never yet existed in the form of a real republic? And he cites Colbert extensively, and it's called Colbertism, or in other terms, dirigism. The idea that the state exists to direct. Dirige means in French to direct. So it doesn't mean it's not Marxist communist. It's just that it's like national capitalism. The nation must play is understood to not be a passive, impotent force, while the private sector is the only economy. It doesn't assume that there is such a dichotomy, but that the nation is the people. It is the expression of the will of the people, and as such exists only for the well-being of the people, because it is the people. The people are the sovereign nation, and that's the point of a sovereign nation, is made up of sovereign people. There's not one sovereign.
Right.
So, and thus, when you have that concept of a living nation made up of sovereign individuals who are expected to think for themselves, have access to their conscience, that's like a well-rounded, I would say, like just mature human. Doesn't mean you all have to think the same way, but you basically have your active conscience. You've used the tool of reasoning. You've sharpened that. They work together. You can basically be trusted to make decent decisions, maybe not perfect, but decent. You'll have good debates that are fruitful in society, right? So that type of society, that type of nation should play a role in using protectionism to defend the development of agro-industrial, labor. It should help or direct the flow of capital in some way towards projects that are long-term, because the state can take a loss in the short term, whereas private interests really can't suffer losses over a sustained period of time. The state can. It doesn't exist for profit, or it shouldn't. So in that sense, that's what Hamilton was studying. That's what Colbert did, and that's what he brought online through especially the support of people like Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, who gave him full backing. Yeah. John Jay was another key, brilliant figure who studied the Peace of Westphalia, and this is, again, it came to be called later on the American system of political economy.
There it is.
And again, it wasn't just it wasn't just nationalist, it wasn't just private capitalist, but it was a blossoming of both. It was a reciprocity, and it was not perfect. It was obviously flawed. We saw the case of the United States going through its turmoil, its roller coaster ride of sometimes having a good, noble character, and it's not just one individual. It's usually a network of co-thinkers who conspire and are able to, like in the case of Colbert, it wasn't just him. It was a whole network of humanists who were able to conspire against the wily ways of the Anglo-Venetian oligarchy, which had their French components. It had Jesuitical components. It had Freemasonic elements to it. It's all different parts of the same, bloodline oligarchic operation. But it's embedded everywhere. No nation is free of it. And the United States never liberated itself fully from it, unfortunately. And because of that, at different times when the oligarchy, when their fifth columns get back into a power position, you usually have assassinations of the noble figures who, again, are not perfect. I'm not trying to say that there's perfect, but they're noble. They're animated by their conscience and are willing to die for the sake of these ideals that they believe firmly in, like Lincoln, like JFK, like FDR, like McKinley. It's a long list.
Right.
And so from there, you have the U.S. being pulled back into a system which Colbert was fighting as well, which is this monetarist liberalism, which is, again, what was the Anglo-Dutch liberal economic model, which had been taking over around the same time that Colbert was active, was at the same time that Britain, England, was being taken over by the Bank of England and this entire Venetian operation that had worked for over a century within the corridors of power, setting up Rosicrucian proto-Freemasonic operations under people like Robert Flood, John Dee, working to, basically turn England into an empire. And it was consummated in 1688. Yep. And at that time, the Dutch banking model that Venice had set up earlier, like in 1609, is when the Bank of Amsterdam was created as the world's first central bank that's private, at least the world. So that was the first time it was in Amsterdam, and it was done as a Venetian operation utilizing the Levant Company, which was a Venetian Levant company that had formerly been the precursor to the Bank of Amsterdam. They had networks that slowly turned Amsterdam into a money worshipping stock market zone where people stopped thinking about their craft, because Amsterdam was a zone that produced Peter Bruegel, Rembrandt, the Huygens family, which were the leading scientists that were discovering, the nature of light. That was like a Renaissance hotbed of republicanism that had fought, and I'm talking here like early 1600s, late 1500s. Amsterdam had fought the Habsburg Empire that had tried to have, they were at that time, the global dominant empire was the Habsburg family. At least that was what was in position of the alpha, the prima inter pares. And they wanted to have, that was where the conduit was going to be for the global world government, the new Roman Empire. And it was in Amsterdam, the Dutch rebellions were the only place that you had the courage of people who are willing to fight against this evil. And they did a damn good job and created a hotbed of culture, but it was only an isolated sort of island of sanity in an otherwise insane world that was falling into the Enlightenment corruption that was starting to there's a lot of corruption. So that had to be crushed, and it couldn't be crushed forcefully from the outside. And so they did exactly what they did to the United States later on after Lincoln had, saved the Union or stopped. Yeah, basically he did. He saved the Union. Yeah. And Britain realized, okay, they had to change strategies. They can't crush the United States the way they tried in 1776 or 1812, or again through their proxies in the Confederacy during the Civil War. So they had to put all of their effort into corrupting it more and more from within and have the U.S. rot itself from the inside. That's what was done to Amsterdam, is you turn these pioneering minds into increasingly people who would believe in this things like the stock market, the power of money, and that weakened Amsterdam to the point that they became then the center command structure for a few decades during the Peace of Westphalia period. It was Amsterdam that was the world of banking. Yep. And then that transplanted itself into England, which, established the Bank of England as on the model of the Bank of Amsterdam. And it was, again, the Venetian party within England around people like Lord John Churchill, the great grandfather of Sir Winston, who was in charge of bringing that thing into operation.
Of course he was. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
No, yeah. I hope everybody's realizing that I hope they can use their mind to visualize some of this. Yeah. Because this is better than like a Netflix series. If you can start to really visualize some of the players, and I know it's hard because there's so many players and just keeping track of where the story and narrative's going. But it is like a movie. Yeah, it is like a movie. And if you can think like that and even read some of Matt's material, because his Clash of the Two Americas spells it out. But when you talk like this, it really gives us a movie-like feeling, right? Like we can see a sense of the players.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the directors of the future are going to have so much to play with.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. We just got to keep bubbling up the ideas from the bottom up. And eventually they will filter to people, I imagine, in positions of power. Because it's not like these ideas are so good and so proven all the way through. Like we can show where the American system was taking hold, and then we can also show where the slavocracy of the Jacksonians was destroying it. Yeah. And we can show, oh, look, we took hold again, and look how we're developing again. This is so good. And oh, look, see, at this stage of the game, we can show it to more and more people. It doesn't have to be a conspiracy. It doesn't have to be. It's really just it's what Cynthia said in her interview recently with the Rogue News. She was like, people just don't want to learn history. And I felt her express that frustration. And we were just talking about that. How do we get people interested in seeing how important history is in the correlation of then present day economics and politics? Right. And if you can get that and really get enthused and inspired by that, your whole world opens up. Yeah, because I mean, there is a historical record. So it's like, we may not have, I was telling Vinny this earlier, we may not have like cameras that were there that we can go back and hit rewind and play, but we have enough information to really get a sense of these characters and which values and codes and principles stand out and that are constantly coming up. You can see where the true value is in a certain vision and how it's repeated with Mazarin or Colbert and FDR and Ben Franklin or John Quincy Adams or Henry Carey, or, you see these ideas and these values just start to repeat, and you're like, okay, like humanity, that's one, dignity, integrity, sovereignty, freedom.
Yeah, exactly. Well said. Yeah, that's the theme, right? That's the theme of the musical piece or the artistic piece, whatever you want to call it, of humanity, which is what we are. I mean, to see us as art, we're living art, and unfortunately there's some bad art out there. Well,
that's why you call it the unfinished symphony. I like that. It's a perfect.
That was the idea of that one. Yeah.
No, but that's the idea all the way through your volumes when you really think about it. It is an unfinished symphony. It's going to go on. You could write 20 volumes in the end. That symphony's we're going to die. It's going to go on. It's not going anywhere.
Which is great, right? Like that's why the universe is not a finished product. The universe will never be a finished product. And
I just love the way they burned down Alexandria and you guys create the digital library of Alexandria.
Yeah, that thing. We share that with everyone.
It's and we're just working cool. We're just bridging it with the AEA website and just giving people good references, and it's going to obviously pull them back to the Rising Tide Foundation. And I think it's just so valuable right now to keep the sharing of the knowledge in these open streams
Mm.
And the way you're getting out with a lot of these different people discovering you is obviously huge for, like, Lyndon LaRouche is smiling on us all, you
for
know, they're
sure.
smiling on you saying, keep going, keep going.
Well, yeah. I mean, like, there's a lot of just beautiful souls out there to really feed in a time of, you know, especially in dark times where there's so many things that kind of weigh down the soul. A lot of turmoil, a lot of uncertainty, and a lot of danger. The best thing is to just look at other people who are strong souls who have been through the fire, and you know, you'll find that these exceptional individuals were exceptional because they did a lot of work, and they earned their wisdom in a hard fought way. They often left traces of their thoughts in the form of writings, or more modern, in more modern times, you have recordings of Martin Luther King Jr., Bobby Kennedy. You can listen to Charles de Gaulle if you speak French.
Brilliant.
And just feed the soul off these good things, and you find that a little bit of them kind of wakes up, you know, or is revived. You start thinking, like, how would JFK think right now? How would Martin Luther King, how would LaRouche think if they were in this position that I'm in, you know? And you get this famous thing that Christians have sort of tapped into this in a certain way with the "what would Jesus do?" It's a perfectly reasonable, that's a good thing to do, right? Like, seriously, it's a high standard to hold yourself to, and you're like, okay, what would Jesus do? And that probably saved a lot of marriages and kept a lot of people out of jail. But you know, you want to have many of these, like, Promethean characters who really were able to tap into the source of wisdom and creative love and shared it. So yeah, I mean, and the American experience, you know, we're talking about Westphalia to the present. If you think about it, like, it was never perfected, but it's always perfecting. And the American Declaration of Independence and the Constitution taken together are really an advancement in many ways that enshrine the principles of Westphalia in a new and more improved way, you could say. It definitely established a foundation upon which a real sovereign nation could be built. Because got to keep in mind, Westphalia was still built around the idea of monarchs. There was still the idea that everybody was equal was not a self-evident idea in France of 1648. So that was a really good innovation and advancement. You had John Quincy Adams and his concept of a community of common principle when he was Secretary of State, formulating the foundations not just of the Monroe Doctrine, which was also not an imperial doctrine. Like, when you look at it at its origins, it was literally to extract and keep out the oligarchical influences and deep state structures that had their control centers in Europe still, from all of the Americas, that were trying to light all of the Americas on fire, and then reconstitute them as a springboard or a base of operations to attack the U.S. from the south. And so John Quincy Adams is like, no, our self-interest is as a continental power that involves all of the Americas, and European hereditary powers have no role to play. Obviously, that didn't fully stop them, but it was a really strong statement. And it was really only when the British-run deep state within America took back real control after McKinley was murdered under Teddy Roosevelt, that you had the Monroe Doctrine really being used now as a tool to suppress the weak, whether it's in the Philippines or whether it's in the Americas, especially. I mean, there's so many horror stories of what the U.S. did under a perversion of this doctrine, but it doesn't mean that the doctrine was bad. It was, like, again, it's the use of it. So again, it was an advancement. The abolition of slavery was, again, an advancement of it, because it was like, yes, you got these beautiful documents saying all men are equal, but we still have this thing where, you know, black slaves, or, like, you know, those who are still only recognized as 3/5 of a human. That's a paradoxical problem that had to be resolved at a certain point. You could say the revolutions in the 60s again was under Martin Luther King's leadership was a refinement of that, you know, yet again, but it was still never perfected. It was never, and internationally speaking, Westphalia came about in a strong way with the principles of the United Nations Charter that was formulated by people like, you know, I mean, you got to look at Franklin Roosevelt's entire network, his core inner circle that did the most work to formulate the principles of this which was supposed to be, not that it turned out this way, but if you look at the charter itself, it's a good charter. It's solid.
Yeah.
Now people will say, oh, but the UN, they're an imperial institution. It's like, well, yeah, there's a lot of that. They did a lot of bad's been done under the UN name, but a lot of bad's been done under the US name too. Does that mean that the US is intrinsically bad? Well, again, soft-minded people would say, yeah, of course, they won't
Cancel
see.
the US.
Yeah, exactly. The Soros education system has brought us that. But despite that, the reality is no, that at the core, the principles are good. The United Nations, same thing. The idea was the sovereignty of nations is enshrined as sacred within the charter. It even enshrines the idea that international law will only be functional to the degree that you work for the economic well-being of all people, of all parts of the world. That's, again, a good, solid, open principle to work with. It's not like, a rigid thing. It's like a spirit. And that's good. You want to give people that open space, but with a stern, strong principle binding that open, creative space to operate within. So there's a lot of really good things like that. And despite the fact that it got corrupted, you had in the Asian part of the world, you had things like the Bandung Conference in Indonesia that was organized by people like Zhou Enlai and Jawaharlal Nehru and people like Kwame Nkrumah. And this is what gave birth to the non-aligned movement. But coming out of the Bandung Conference were the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, which were trying. It was the Asian African way. I mean, even Tito of Czechoslovakia was a big leader, a part of this thing. That was their way of trying to get the West back to our principled senses. And they were basically saying, look, those 5 principles, they're all Westphalian ultimately, but they're also based upon principles like Tianming that you find enshrined in ancient Confucian tradition going back thousands of years, that there's a harmony of the heavens and a mandate of heaven, that human law has to always aspire to reflect the law of the heavens. And to the degree that a leader arises that abuses that, they lose their mandate of heaven despite their authority, and the people have a right to throw off the shackles of said abusive ruler. That is enshrined in ancient Chinese psyche. And it's right there in the principles of the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, which then were upgraded the year later in 1955 to the 10 principles. But people can go and read what those are, and you could see very clearly the benefit of the other, the principle that each of our self-interests are only maintained when all of our self-interests are being improved. That is key. Non-intervention into another country. That's in the UN Charter. It's there in the 5 principles. It's common. So again, you see this across the board. And of course, it came from Roosevelt in terms of the 20th century in the West, the revival of this principle, because I mean, Roosevelt did what? He, as we were alluding to, he brought back the Colbertist principle, both on an economic front, but he also declared war on Wall Street. He broke up the Wall Street banks through the Glass-Steagall Act. He pulled hundreds of bankers into court by giving Ferdinand Pecora broad subpoena powers. He forced the public, or he forced them to show what they did abusively that got us into this unnecessary Great Depression, and how they continued to abuse their authority during the Great Depression, basically just stealing wealth from the people, while they were not trying to rehabilitate the economy. He forced that all into the public light, right? Which gave him a power of action that also allowed him to declare war on London, where he sabotaged the London Bankers Conference as well, that tried to have a one world government, a form of Great Reset back in 1933. He sabotaged that.
Yeah. I mean, both Colbert and FDR really were focused on like putting the truth out there, like really like giving the disclosures and, setting up the Chamber of Commerce or Chamber of Justice, and, FDR setting up the SEC to oversee the corporations. Like there were a lot of similarities in their approach. And I'm wondering, like, why do you think that they were both successful to the degrees that they were? I mean, they attacked so much, huge projects, sciences, arts, like so many different facets of society.
Yeah. I'm also wondering too, like at the turn of the century, prior to that, when McKinley was assassinated, like that was actually a point in our U.S. history where we really went, where the globalists pushed us toward going imperial minded in our like conquest outside the states. Like before, it was a battle with the slavocracy of the South. Quite, was where the main concentrations end up there in that Boston area as well, right? So they had their concentrations, but then at that turn of the century, then it becomes more, yeah, we're gonna go, invade this country over here. We're gonna what was the first one? Well, it's the one that was going on in 1898. It was with Spain, right? Isn't that the Spanish-American War of 1898? And then it just kept going from there. Like it didn't stop. Like it didn't really stop until FDR shows up and we're going through a depression. Hello, right? After 30 years of it. It almost feels like the 30 Years War in our own way in the United States, that period. And then now FDR is like, okay, now how can we once again bring back the true American system to work for the people? It just, does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I think it does. I mean, I see the closest thing to the 30 Years War in some ways. Obviously, the Civil War really stands out because you got is a dominantly Christian nation still in those days, and you got Christian killing Christian, both sides saying, like God's on my side, no, God's on my side. Same thing as you had in the 30 Years War. And what came out of that again, it was again a very Colbertist response too, very much like what Roosevelt did in response to the Great Depression, which was under the leadership of people like Henry C. Carey, but there were many others. You had the unleashing of national credit through treasury bonds, things like the 420 bond or the 520 bonds that matured in 5 or 20 years, that were all tied to building big projects. You had the greenbacks as well, issued as acts of Congress through Article 1, Section 8, for the first time really utilized since the days, I mean, really, it had been 30 years or more that Andrew Jackson had killed the Second National Bank. And even before that, it wasn't even really being used properly anyway. It had been run by a bunch of deep state agents who hated it. So the thing wasn't really being used the way the Colbertists of the Hamiltonian persuasion understood that it could be the credit emitter that would, provide loans both for small enterprises as well as large scale projects like the Erie Canal, which was sort of like an American version of the Midi Canal, the Languedoc Canal of France that Colbert oversaw. So this is what Lincoln brought back with the greenbacks. It was again Article 1, Section 8. It was the act of Congress that would then give a command to the Treasury to issue certain bonds that would then be monetized through a banking facility. And the greenbacks were a big part of what allowed for this type of very low interest credit system to reemerge. And I'm not talking Visa credit. This is like a productive credit system. And it was all tied to the transcontinental railway, the industrialization prospects of not just the North, but the idea was under proper Reconstruction that never was permitted to happen, was to really bring in mass industrialization into the South that could then liberate themselves economically from relying, as they had, upon cheap slave labor, right? Basically today, like globalization sweatshops. That's the same principle.
Yeah. Same thing, man.
It could only work if you provide Africa, like in today's case, you would good economics would be under this principle, provide Africa, all African nations, the ability to have industrial sovereignty to produce for themselves and stand on their own 2 feet economically, and not rely upon child labor in cobalt mines in Congo. Like it's absurd. And we turn a blind eye because we make a lot of money, and a lot of ideologues know that that's the only way they're going to get their photovoltaic cells for their Green New Deals, is by using child labor. So that, we still use, and that's child labor, but there's, people who get paid $1 a day. I'm sorry, it's still a form of slavery. You just don't call it that. Yeah. So that was sabotage. Ulysses S. Grant wanted it, but it would have taken many decades to properly do a full-blown industrialization. And Ulysses S. Grant had a lot on his hands. He did a lot of good things, but he had his hands tied a lot too. And once he was out, you had a whole slew of traitorous, and I'll use the word maybe lightly, idiots, I'll say, some traitors who took power up until McKinley, who basically re-empowered the slave power to recapture all of their former slaves who are now called free people. Sure, they were called legally like full human beings who had like one vote, one man. That's all good. But now they were like sharecroppers, right? So they're still like bound to the same lords that were whipping them just a few years earlier. Now they're getting paid a few pennies, but still living in impoverishment, probably even worse in some of these cases.
Jeez.
And you wonder, how is it that like South Carolina had in their state legislature something like half of the state legislative elected officials were Black in the 1870s. You can see these photographs, and it's like half of the state legislature was Black. And then you jump ahead 80 years in the future, and you're not allowed to like drink at the same water fountain as a white person. And all of a sudden you can't vote. How did that happen? Right?
Well, I think I remember
went backwards.
I remember reading that there were times when in the late 1800s, there were a few strikes that happened. And one of them happened down in New Orleans at one of the docking, one of the docking corporations or whatever was operating down there. And the Blacks and the whites started kind of picketing together.
Oh, I
remember. And I remember them commenting and say how that kind of sent shockwaves into that imperialist Southern mindset. And they were like, we have to find a way to reinvigorate the Jim Crow system. And I do believe that was a huge impetus of why that happened, because I've always thought about that. How come it took 100 years to 1960s? And what you said, why there was black and white bathrooms when you watch that movie with Vigo and he takes it was all the Green Book.
The Green Book.
The Green Book.
Yeah, it's a great movie.
Yeah, the Green Book, right? So why was that still going on? It's because they got threatened by it at a time where they were like, no, we got to start this. So I think it literally started in the earlier part of the 20th century where you began to see that, probably more in the Deep South first, and then how it spread. It didn't get everywhere. It didn't get out to California. It didn't get way up north, but it was in enough places. And I got cousins down in Mississippi that when I visited them back in the 90s and came through there, you could feel like you were back 100 years. Just in the way they talk to each other, black, white. It was like I don't even really want to on this podcast share exactly what it felt like, but the racial energy was just accepted. The racial undercurrent tones, the racism was there, but not really challenged in any way. It was just I guess the best way would be is almost like just accepted or adopted. After so many, and this is what, 1990s. It's just so embedded. I think rising above racism takes a certain level of education and also awareness of self, of soul. If you don't get a sense of soul, then you get caught up in a lot of differences. When something that's going to bring us all to a common humanity, then you can start to rise above racism. Now, it's easy to use for color revolution tactics, but the truth is, the good is better than the bad and the ugly that they keep putting out there. I'm gonna keep going back to that.
Yeah. No, our nature, obviously, when left to ourselves, our nature is to generally like cooperate, work together, and see ourselves in the other, despite the colors or other differences that might be there. And it takes a lot of work to make us into these artificial, hateful, ignorant characters who are just these. I mean, it's atrocious to see the behavior of most of humanity much of the time. But it would be wrong to think like that's our nature, what we see as the majority or the norm, right? We're told, oh, what's normal is what we are. It's like, well, and like the Gandhis, the Martin Luther Kings, the Lincolns, those are the abnormals. Right. Those are like the outliers.
The outliers, yeah.
We don't have to think. But it's like, wait a minute, what if we got this all wrong? What if they're representative of like normal, healthy people?
Exactly.
They're unhealthy. What if the majority has been unhealthy most of the time up until now?
Well, and that's what we're showing by doing this universalist approach to history, where you're looking at all those things, all those components is what you're expressing.
Yeah, exactly. And so, I mean, like, and you see how these things run tandem, right? Like allowing or encouraging a culture internally within a nation that becomes divided among itself as a house divided, where one group or little subgroups think that they're better than other groups. And thus you get all of the tension, all of the animosity, all of the potential rage that builds up. And
competition.
Oligarchs love that stuff. That's why they cultivate it, because they want it's divide to conquer. They love being able to cultivate, they're the arsonist burning down everybody's houses and then blaming everybody in the village. That's the other guy who burned down your house. But it's like, this is the arsonist who doesn't live in your village. They just want the whole village to be controlled, or to be controlled by them. So as soon as you allow this to happen a little bit too much, you all of a sudden create a breeding ground also for acting like an empire more and more on others, because you allow this Hobbesianism, right? You allow this each against all ethic to become normalized, and then all of a sudden, well, each nation is a unit in a family of nations, and that family can be really twisted and toxic, right? As a nation family, or as a community of other nations as a higher family, that can become toxic too. And the most powerful paranoid group might try to suppress the weaker. And that's what we had with the death of McKinley, ushered in this type of approach to eugenics internally, right? Like Teddy Roosevelt empowered, he created the FBI, or he at least empowered Charles Bonaparte, his attorney general, as Cynthia went through in her new documentary. Again, a cousin of Napoleon Bonaparte, right? Is now the Attorney General of America. How did that happen? So he empowers him to create the FBI as a Freemasonic sort of secret policing operation within the United States, modeled on MI6, which is also just being created as well, or MI5, sorry.
Yeah.
MI6, that's only revealed publicly like a century later, is also created at the same time, managing the creation of these U.S. secret policing operations. You have eugenics research being promoted by Teddy Roosevelt in universities. The Rockefeller Foundation is being brought online as well to serve as basically just a conduit to pour tons of money into educational reform, health reform, medicine, everything you could imagine that could be corrupted and call it science. That's what the Rockefeller Foundation was doing. That's what the Carnegie Foundation was doing. So again, you have this slide towards bigotry, because eugenics and bigotry are not that different as it's targeting like the idea that we could purify the human gene pool, but it's like, who's doing the purifying? Who's controlling the filter of what they think is like normal good breeding, right? It's going to be people who themselves are not applying these standards to themselves. They're above the system that they're managing. So these superhumans, right, from above, these Leviathan representatives from above. You have the KKK coming back into force, especially under Woodrow Wilson, who amplifies the KKK that had formerly like fallen to the wayside in the decades after around McKinley's time. It's brought back in. The Birth of a Nation is played like this is a KKK racist movie that's played at the White House and promoted. So all of this stuff is happening. Jim Crow laws are expanding like we've never seen before under Teddy and then Woodrow. The Federal Reserve in this chaos and corruption, the Federal Reserve is then created in 1913 too, as this foreign entity of sorts with quasi-national but not really aspects to it as a financial beast that's there to then create a new type of, again, it's like the Bank of England, right? It's like a private central bank loyal only to the interests of Wall Street and London central bankers and other central bankers in Spain, in Europe. And so all of this is coming online as the US is destroying and governments in Nicaragua and in Cuba and Smedley Butler documents what he was assigned to do for like 30 years working for the US military and the Marines, just overthrowing governments that were not cooperating with Standard Oil, the Rockefeller machine, or the United Fruit Company. And he documents all of it. He names names and people could read his War is a Racket if they want published.
Yeah, I've read it. I love that book.
Solid little testimony.
Oh, good.
Yeah. So this is
I
what
just like
Roosevelt.
I like getting. I think that would be really good to get more whistleblowers to blow the whistle, because it's always nice, like when a guy like Butler with that kind of career blows the whistle on the corporatocracy that he was working on behalf of, and all these banksters and pirates of profit. Like
Yeah.
he just called it out so well, and because of his reputation, it actually did make a ripple. And obviously, we know that he basically, in his own way, saved that coup d'etat they were trying to do on FDR by blowing the whistle on these guys using him.
Yeah.
Oh, that was brilliant.
Exactly.
You did a good job on that. Or you and your friend, what's his name again? Dahl?
Jason Dahl. Yeah.
Jason. Yeah, Jason Dahl in that piece on Smedley. That was a really good one.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I'm really happy with how that turned out. Yeah, we're going to be doing a whole series of these things, but yeah, you're right. And the FDR really earned the ire of this whole network that we're sponsoring fascism as like the new solution to global economic problems was fascism. And fascism was essentially just another way of saying world government, but world government needs enforcers. And so to get that regimentation of human beings, it's an unnatural thing. You need to have a strong man. You need to use a lot of social engineers, scientific engineers that would then influence the mechanisms of propaganda as much as possible in order to get the population to become entranced in a certain way. This is what the was done under Goebbels. It was done all over Italy. It's it was being done in the United States as well. And there were Nazi marches with George Washington and Hitler and swastikas flying side by side.
That's so crazy.
Yeah, down New York Street and Madison Square Gardens.
I know.
And we had similar things in Canada, in Quebec. We had Adrien Arcand, the Quebec Nazi. We had it. This is being sold as the miracle, silver bullet solution to all of our problems. In a similar way that the Great Reset today is also being sold as a miracle solution, or it will be sold. Currently, I don't think the shock therapy is bad enough for people to accept that. But this is how they're planning on selling it is, okay, you want to stop starving? You don't like starving anymore? You want your kids to have
controlled demolition.
some bug-based bread?
Well, own nothing and be happy.
Yeah, exactly. You want to be happy, right? Now, and the reality is that, as we saw back with the rise of fascism, it's just a recipe for more wars. I mean, Hitler had a whole plan with his counterparts in Britain, like Oswald Mosley, Neville Chamberlain. You had Lloyd George, again, another still living leading Nazi British guy with the big chunk of the royals were still pro-Nazi, and they had a whole view for Africa and the Middle East as being zones of slave labor and nothing but. It was going to be basically slave colonies. China was going to be a slave colony. Russia was going to be a slave colony. Most of South America, subhuman slave colony. And in their minds, they would have local mini little warlords with their encrusted, locally controlled elites that would self-manage the system, the way that the British were able to utilize their corrupt Brahmins in the caste system of India to control their own people. So the British would have not very much input to physically do. The system would be self-controlling. And just like we saw with the whites and the blacks in the 19th century, who were working together on so many levels against their common oppressors, which was then forgotten and subverted. The same thing happened before partition, right? When you had in the 1944-45, all of these amazing situations of Muslims and Hindus and Sikhs marching side by side against their common British oppressor, which under Churchill had overseen the murder of over 3 million Bengalis in the Bengal famines.
Boy, they don't want you to know about that, do they? Ooh, buddy.
They'll say it was maybe an accident of the weather, but no, this is like openly acknowledged. Like Churchill probably killed more Indians than Hitler killed Jews, and he bragged about it. He said, they just breed like rabbits anyway. We'll just kill a few million more. So, yeah, this is what was the case. They were all, these different groups of religious groups were all working together for their common humanity, their common love of freedom. And this is what the British had to subvert, with very similar way that they got the US to try to fight itself and eat itself in the Civil War. They did the same thing by creating, these false ethnic partitions of Pakistan, where they just they basically extracted all of the Muslims that had been living in a pretty harmonious way overall, all over India, and just like put them all in that one spot. And then along the way, you had like 1 million people dying in fights and skirmishes. They induced people to just like kill each other. They get Hindus to kill Sikhs and vice versa. And they bought a little bit of time. So you had Lord Mountbatten, the pedophile freak that he was, who trained Prince Philip, who was there overseeing the cutting up artificially of a fake country. I don't want to call it fake because now it's got legitimacy.
Sure.
We don't want to put it away, but I'm just saying, like, it could have been much better. Now at this point, Pakistan has, it's had its good noble leaders over the years. Hopefully, the spirit that was revived, especially with the new Silk Road, with Pakistan playing a very important role, especially with the extension of the Silk Road into Afghanistan via Pakistan. That's going to continue to move ahead, and we're going to get some, new viable, good things happening. Same thing for India, which does look like it's finally going through a big awakening right now, with a real move towards the east, with a pro-China or pro-Russia, generally pro-China, but you can't just say that out loud.
Right.
In India, there's a lot of baggage there, but they've got a pro-Eastern orientation that's based upon, again, a Colbertist idea of economic development. There's large-scale projects in both India and in China right now that we'd only seen with Franklin Roosevelt and Lincoln. We haven't seen that in the West in over 70 years, but we're seeing that in Asia. It's very synergistic. It's built around the idea of this state, again, emitting credit like the Chinese 4 major state banks are doing for large-scale development into magnetic levitation, high-speed rail trains, water diversion projects, of which the biggest are happening right now in China and in India. You have the international, north-south transportation corridor going from St. Petersburg in Russia all the way down through Armenia. It branches off into Turkey, into Azerbaijan. This is a great way to get the Azerbaijani Muslims and the Armenians to start working together on a common project, very similar in effect to what Lincoln was trying to do after the Civil War, or what Colbert did do. This would extend down into Iran. It would go down into a port in the south of Iran that would then have a shipping region that would connect directly into India, as well as into other zones, including Pakistan. So you have all of these things right now that are all sort of this very synergistic, or is that the word, synergy? Yes.
Yeah, sure.
With the Belt and Road Initiative of China, which is an east-west, but now you have a north-south quarter, all of which involve win-win cooperation, anti-Hobbesianism, getting people on the same page as humans first, and whatever your linguistic or ethnic or color of skin tone feature secondary, but human first. And it works. It works damn well. And every time we do it, we find that the effects are in the long term. Explosions of population living standards. More people can be sustained as well quantitatively, but at a higher quality of life over the same given area of land on average. So you have all of these things that Malthusians are afraid of and despise, because they want us to become convinced that all we can do is just adapt to controlled, limited environments that have resource scarcity, that are, that's all we can do. But no, we're actually demonstrating here, and humanity constantly demonstrates that we always leap beyond those limits, and we're happier when we do it. We have more access to our inner sense of self-worth and well-being, and just generally it's good on every level. And I think humans instinctively know it, even though intellectually we're maybe separated from that which is within our heart. But push us, I think, to the brink, and generally the heart starts acting in a more active way than when we're at a passive, like during the last 50 years, you could say, oh, it's been consumer society stagnation. It's been a bit of a dream state. There's been a false sense of security in many people living in the comfortable part of the West. And in such a state, the intellectual side of what we think reality is that has no bearing on the truth can maybe overweigh what the heart knows is right. But when you finally turn that upside down, as many people are realizing that reality is totally not what they thought it was, the heart's going to be playing more and more of a role. The conscience is going to be more activated as people look for solutions. How do you put out the fire? And frankly, the only water that can put out the fire right now, that's based on historically precedented principles that work, that take down the oligarchy's power, like it or not, is what China is primarily doing today.
Yeah.
And also Russia,
Right.
which is why they've been so attacked, maligned, slandered, and why so many Westerners, including maybe some people who might be listening to this, are so afraid and have so many prejudices and assumptions about what China or Russia are, or other countries, or Iran, because they've been profiled. Westerners have been profiled since the Cold War, since the 50s especially, and all of these prejudices that have been profiled in us and that worked us so much into a frenzy in the 1950s and 60s under McCarthyism are being revived yet again, so that our house is on fire, and we are being led to believe that the water that can put out the fire in our house is actually our enemy.
Yes.
We have to get over that.
It is.
That is just so twisted.
But like I brought this quote up to Vinny earlier because it's FDR in his Four Freedoms speech, and it, like, when you were just expressing that, it's the fact that, like, it can be done. Like FDR saw Colbert do it. Like, so many people saw him, and through his actions and what he was able to accomplish, he proved that it could be done, and that it is a workable, viable way of fostering growth in societies and sovereign nation states. So I'll just read a little bit about it because I love it. It says, well, after he's talking about the Four Freedoms, he says, that is no vision of a distant millennium. It is a definite basis for a kind of world attainable in our own time and generation. That kind of world is the very antithesis of the so-called new order of tyranny, which the dictators seek to create with the crash of a bomb. And then he goes on to say, the world order which we seek is the cooperation of free countries working together in a friendly, civilized society. And he continues, freedom means the supremacy of human rights everywhere. To that high concept, there can be no end save victory. And that ending, it's just like they're like, that's it. It's so moving to see that in 1941, the spirit of that had been continued on all the way back to the classics. Like I said, like these virtues and these principles are so high that they endure.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's alive, right? You could just see that, and just whenever you read a speech or a transcript of a speech by FDR, you could just see that this classical education that he had access to created a heart which was just, it was like he references the ancient he'll reference Homer, he'll reference characters of the past that most people don't think about, because we tend to be a little bit more myopic in your day-to-day average life, where we tend to think about our immediate concerns. But FDR became the type of exceptional person. I mean, yeah, you could say his family helped. Okay, he's born into an upper crust family. Yeah, that helped. It gave him connections. Sure. Same thing for JFK. But that's not what made him exceptional. That's not what made him an enemy to the oligarchy. And that's not what made him such a beacon of power, that even to this very day, the potential revival of his spirit and method of thinking and policy represents a nightmare to the oligarchy today. It's because he internalized history in the way that we're all trying to internalize it, as one unified process. And it's like Plato is alive in him. Mm-hmm. Jesus is alive. Like all of these figures, you could see he's read their original writings. He's thought about it. He's worked through a lot of this. JFK too and Bobby Kennedy, same thing. You could read their speeches. They're dropping Aeschylus bombs, Sophocles bombs left and right. And they just internalized looking at history as a drama, as a classical tragedy. And they could see themselves as a player on the stage, and they don't want to be tragic. We all have a little tragedy within us, and that's where free will comes in a play. It's a beautiful thing. Mm-hmm. And we could choose to get on top of our shit and not be tragic, to break our cycles. Sure. It takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of willpower, but it every time it's done we're happier in the long run, though not as happy in the short term, because kind of, you know, you want the addictions, you want to satisfy whatever you want to satisfy. That's keeping you in a cycle. That gives you the immediate happiness, but not the long-term happiness. It actually creates greater sorrow.
Sure.
So these people went through those cycles. They broke it. They went through the fire, as Dante outlined. You know, the example of Virgil guiding himself, Dante, through the fire from purgatory into paradise.
Sure.
Took a lot of work. You had to go all the way through the inferno. That was hellish, literally. You had to go all the way through purgatory, work your way up through the 9 rings, and then finally you could confront the fire, and he could choose to jump through it because he, again, had the metaphor of Beatrice, right? The spirit of love that was guiding him in wisdom, kind of like an Athena character, sort of inspiring him to like have faith that you can come out of this. You're better than this cycle that you're stuck in. And all the way to through his experience in the Paradiso that a lot of people just don't read, right? Because we're in a very cynical society where we resonate like the Inferno, you know, we don't like the Paradise. So it's yeah, I think definitely human beings, we're destined for something better. I definitely think we're destined. And I think FDR understood this. And by the way, I'll just say for any haters right now, because I mean, every time I talk about FDR, you guys probably have a similar experience. Haters happen because there's been a lot of, so I can't say how much, I've never seen so much work and energy put into creating false constructs and narratives about what a man was and how he thought than with FDR. He was not a Keynesian. He was an enemy of John Maynard Keynes, and Keynes despised him, though we're told he was a Keynesian. And every Democrat is told, you know, yeah, you're supposed to love FDR because he was a devoted follower of John Maynard Keynes. That's what Jeffrey Sachs says. That's what every Democrat controller is led to believe or expects their adherents to believe. And that's why Republicans reject FDR, because they could see that John Maynard Keynes is an imperial eugenics loving, you know, pedophile who wanted a central banker's world government. And the reality is, no, it's the very opposite. FDR was a devoted student of Alexander Hamilton, Colbert, and Lincoln. He called for, you know, basically taking Lincoln because the Republican Party had become the party of Wall Street over the course of the 1920s under Coolidge, leading up through the Great Depression under Hoover. And he basically said, look, the Republican Party was once strong and solid and good under Lincoln. It was the party of abolition of slavery. And now it's the party of Wall Street. So let's take Lincoln over to the Democrat side. And let's do that. And for a period, the Democratic Party, all the way up through John F. Kennedy and his brother, was a driving force of goodness. And so you could see that it's not about parties, right? One party could come and go and become good at one point and become corrupted at another, but if there's something higher to this whole process, that's this sort of force that we're dovetailing on, right? Of universal history moving us towards what I think we all have faith in is a destiny where we mature as a species that finally sheds the burden of the belief in these illusions like Hobbesianism and the idea that we should have hereditary power managing us. And finally, when we accept that higher identity, then we'll be a species that can be sovereign, where every individual can actually have democracy. We can have democracy because every individual will be able to discover that they love wisdom as the highest pleasure beyond all other pleasures. And if you can get every person aiming toward, or at least striving towards that, albeit imperfectly, you're good. You're good to go. You'll have problems. There will be dramas. There might be conflict in the future, but as long as you have people accessing conscience and reason at the same time and expressing that through constant economic development and leaping over the limits to growth, going into space exploration, right? Looking towards always the next frontier. And it sounds kind of like romantic Star Trek-y, but yeah, it kind of is that. But it works. It actually does tap us into something that is in alignment with what I believe is Tianming, the principle of the mandate of heaven, that we, you know, and the Chinese, if you listen, and I'm ranting now, I'm sorry, but if you listen to the Chinese, the head of their space agency, I forgot his name, but he gave this beautiful speech on the heavenly kingdom. You guys heard about the heavenly kingdom?
No.
That's the name that the Chinese gave their space station.
Really?
Oh,
No, I didn't know that.
And he had this beautiful metaphor where he got across that, look, the solar system is like the South China Sea, and we have to go out and explore the seas. And at some point we all explored the seas on Earth. And now we're going to have to go and explore the oceans of the heavens. So it's a very strong idea that has living force in policymaking circles amongst Eurasian networks right now, which is how people like John F. Kennedy used to speak and think, and people like James Webb, who ran NASA as an administrator and organized JFK around his strategic thinking on nuclear propulsion, fusion energy, space more generally. They all thought in these terms and wrote, and you can hear their speeches speaking on these terms. And the fact that we don't probably know that is just a sign that our education system failed us. But it's all available. If we search for it, we will find these speeches, and you will find this vibrant faith in human beings as a species of the universe. And the universe is our home. It's not like we live in this like closed island surrounded by darkness and emptiness and coldness where aliens want to kill us. That's not our home. Our home is this saturated ocean of existence and life being everywhere, right? Like, I'm not talking here necessarily about aliens, but I mean like life is a principle which permeates all space, right? It's cosmic radiation. It's constant creation. New suns are being born out of galactic centers, and supernovae are coming into being, creating, whole spectrum of isotopes that are participating in living processes, and electromagnetic fields are harmonizing and calibrating the flow of all of this creation that we can finally think about and tap into and act upon. I mean, my God, if you needed a purpose to life, what more do you need? Terms, right? Like it's.
And where do you go? You go to the Rising Tide Foundation here.
We're trying to help.
Plug his book.
Yeah.
There's volume 3, and we want to plug Cynthia's book.
Right on.
Cool. Rising Tide Foundation.
Please do support the Rising Tide Foundation, the spreading of this knowledge, and so much of what we just have so much fun getting into it. We love talking about it. We love finding those quotes and sharing it with people. I think it really is bubbling up to the top. Robert David Steele, God bless his soul, he always talked about people being blackmailed, bribed, and brainwashed. And, it always kind of stuck in my head. And I thought, well, what's a good anti-thesis of bribed, blackmailed, and brainwashed? And I thought, well, your dignity and your integrity and your soul sovereignty. Because if you're bribed, well, let's see, how would that work? If you're blackmailed, then that's going to affect your dignity. If you're bribed, that'll probably affect your integrity, if you're going to take the bribe or not take the bribe. And the brainwashing messes with your soul sovereignty, right? It kind of strips you of your own sense of your true essence. So I think that's really good to be aware of for some of the effects of what the social engineers are so good at. But I think there's easy ways to counter it within our individual lives and within our smaller friendship circles. It'll ripple eventually to cities and states and countries. But I think a lot of this is real grassroots. And I don't know, there's something kind of cool about it. And at the same time, at times it's a little bit like, oh man,
This is gonna take
like, yeah, how long is this my idea going to percolate into manifestation? But
yeah. Well, the way I tend to see it, very similar way. And, like you obviously, there's no formula for success, never has been, but you capacity build, and you do it through love. Like you have to just try to always have humility, try to always love the truth, try to always care about other people, care about yourself at the same time. And you're always kind of thinking back and forth, right? Like how you're sort of like, no one's you don't want other people necessarily to discipline you, but to be sovereign, it means you got to discipline yourself, right? If you're not master of yourself, I mean, someone else is going to be your master. And a lot of people right now, they're like, well, I'm not a slave. I'm free. I've got a vote. And it's like, yeah, but do you know where your thoughts and convictions come from? Most people didn't take the time to think about the fact that it didn't come from them. Their opinions about most of everything were not internally generated. So who did? It's people who want you to move in a certain way that don't care about you. actually they despise you, and you've taken on, you've become their instrument. So, you know, we have to always self-reflect. And I think that's the most simple in some ways and difficult in other ways thing for people to do, is just to sort of like, as Robbie Burns, I think, was the one who said it, like, the greatest gift that God had given us is to let us see ourselves as others see us.
Yes.
He did that in his Robbie Burns way, though. This is like hardcore Scottish, very hard to understand English, but yeah, just to remove yourself and look back upon yourself, and then make an objective judgment based upon the fact that, you know, your subjective objective barrier is actually not real. We're all part of the same, apparently subjective universe. There is objective truth, but this universe which produced us has design, intention to it. It has purpose. It has morality. It has things we shouldn't do, right? If there's natural law, that means that there's some form of a unifying lawmaker of some form. There's something there that
karmic justice, right?
Common justice. Yeah. I mean, it has different names, but the point is, it's like, it exhibits characteristics. The universe exhibits characteristics that one would normally only say you would find in a subjective individual, but it's like, it's embedded design, intention, purpose. And this is something which is, so it's like, that's also within us. We're both partially objective and partially subjective. And so we have to work that as best as we can. And yeah, like when you build your capacities, it's through like building relationships, like, you know, we're friends, we're trying to build other friend groups.
Sure.
And as you do that, you if you do it in the right way, you generally are trying to make each other better and making yourself better at the same time. And you're building capacities so that, I don't know what the answer is, but I know that when opportunities arise, people who do this will be in a much better position to act wisely when the time comes, you know. And who knows what will be the moment. I don't know if Martin Luther King in the early 50s imagined that within a decade he would find himself confronted with these various opportunities, and he made the right judgment and found himself increasingly in a position of influence and authority that he could then do more good. But he didn't waste his time. He used it well, and he took those when those choices came to him. He was able to have the strength to make the right decisions and to use the responsibilities that he was uniquely qualified, not uniquely, but I guess uniquely. He uniquely qualified himself to be in that position and do it well. So I think a lot of people I think one of our biggest enemies right now is wasting time. I battle it with myself too on Telegram and social media. And I just realized that sometimes like my ability to just like focus is reduced. And I know a lot of people suffer from that, and we just have to like get back to our ability to just focus, you know?
Yeah. Well, they say where your attention goes, your energy goes.
Exactly.
We're always trained. We're trained to go to the still point. And it's just a self-discipline of going. It might be in your heart center. It might be more in your will center. But that still point, and how when you get there, everything just goes real, not only still, but it was that zone you were in when you were finishing, when you were writing. That's almost a little active representation of the still point, because you're in that zone. But getting there and then having no activity going on, let's say physically, is quite, you can luxuriate in that. We've luxuriated in it for long periods of time, but not that we would be out of body. We like to stay present in body. I found the more I'm grounded, the higher I can soar.